Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. It's the year 1847 on a huge cotton farm just outside of Charleston, South Carolina, and things are starting to happen that nobody would find out about for over 100 years. The Harrington house, with its big white pillars and tall oak trees, looked super fancy and rich on the outside. But inside, behind all that pretty stuff, a really heavy drama was building up that would eventually mess up everyone's life. The very first weird thing was written down by Reverend Thomas Whitfield in a church record from April 23rd. It said that young Master Harrington had skipped church for the 6th week in a row, and while his dad said he was sick, the doctor said nobody had called him to the house at all. The Harrington family had been big shots in Charleston since way before the American Revolution. Ebenezer Harrington, a really successful merchant who had also gotten into owning a plantation, was known for being super smart with money and for having a ton of rare books. His wife Elizabeth had died while having their second baby, and that baby girl also didn't make it past 2 days old. So that left just one kid, a son named William, to one day take over everything Ebenezer had. People in town saw William as a serious young man who had gone to school up north and came back with more open-minded ideas, but he was smart enough to keep quiet about those ideas in public. Looking back at the records from 1846, Ebenezer had bought several new workers for his house, including a young woman named Adeline, who he got from a plantation in Virginia that was going broke. The county records describe the Harrington house as a big 3-story mansion sitting back from the Cooper River, with fancy gardens and a separate kitchen building. The main house had 14 rooms, including a library that visitors always talked about because it had so many books. The places where the enslaved workers stayed were tucked behind the gardens, hidden from the main house by a bunch of magnolia trees. The sounds around the plantation were pretty normal: horses in the stables, workers out in the fields, and the faraway bells from St. Michael's Church ringing out the hours. But neighbors would later tell investigators that by early spring of 1847, there was this weird, heavy feeling hanging over the whole place. The first sign that something was off actually came from Ebenezer himself. His business journal started showing that he was getting more and more annoyed with how his son was acting. One entry said William was missing dinner again, claiming he was reading in his room, but the books in the library hadn't even been touched. Another entry from May 5th said his son had asked to talk privately about running the house and had suggested ridiculous changes to how things were arranged, and that his fancy education had filled his head with unrealistic ideas and that he needed to think about doing something more drastic. William Harrington was 23 years old that spring, having come back from Harvard the year before. His dad had a clear plan for him: learn the family business, get ready to take over the plantation, and marry a girl from one of the other rich families they were friends with. The local Charleston paper used to mention him all the time at first, going to fancy parties and dinners with families like the Pinckneys and the Rutledges. But by March, his name had completely stopped showing up in those kinds of stories. Martha Pinckney, whose diary is still kept at the Charleston Historical Society, wrote that young Mr. Harrington had said no to another invitation the 3rd time that month, and that her mom said old Mr. Harrington seemed worried but didn't say much when people asked. The people who worked in the house noticed things changing too. James Green, who took care of the stables and talked about it later, said young William had started taking long solo rides super early in the mornings, coming back with his horse all sweaty and tired, even though he claimed he had just gone out to check on the far fields. The cook, a woman named Esther who had been with the family since before William was born, told the housekeeper that the young master had been spotted several times sneaking into the kitchen building after dark, asking for food at really weird hours. She especially noticed that he kept asking for Adeline specifically to bring the food to his room. Adeline, according to the inventory records, was about 19 years old. She was described as educated, and she had been bought to work inside the house, mainly helping with guests and helping write letters. The sale paper noted she could read, which was pretty unusual and made her cost more money. Church records show she had been baptized on the Virginia plantation, but her parents were just listed as unknown. The only description we have of what she looked like comes from one small note in Ebenezer's records that said she had a refined look and manner that would impress visitors. and that her lighter skin tone suggested her family had been house servants for generations. The early summer of 1847 was brutally hot in the South Carolina lowlands. The Harrington records show they spent a ton of money getting ice delivered from Charleston just to cool down the main house. During this time, Ebenezer's journal entries got more and more messy and anxious. He wrote that William had refused an invitation from the Rutledges, claiming a headache, but then Ebenezer saw him out walking the garden paths after midnight, which he called troubling behavior. He also wrote that personal stuff had gone missing from his dead wife's trunk, that he had confronted the household staff but nobody admitted anything, and that he couldn't figure out who did it. The local doctor, Dr. Malcolm Dale, was finally called out to the Harrington place on June 12th. His medical records have this strange little note that says he had been called to the plantation, but not for the young master like he expected. Instead, it was for a female house servant. Her symptoms looked like nervous exhaustion, so he prescribed rest and a break from her duties. He also noted that Mr. Harrington Sr. was unusually upset about her condition, and that she was being kept in the East Wing guest room instead of the workers' quarters, which he found to be a very unusual arrangement. That summer kept getting more tense as people around the place started to notice. Delivery men reported hearing shouting coming from the study. The postmaster in Charleston noticed William was sending way more letters to cities up north than usual. A tutor who worked at a nearby plantation saw William and Adeline having what looked like a really intense conversation near the garden wall, and they jumped apart fast when they realized someone was watching. Things really blew up in July. Church records show Ebenezer Harrington met privately with Reverend Whitfield 3 Wednesdays in a row. Nobody wrote down what they talked about, but right after those meetings, Ebenezer reached out to a slave trader in Charleston. The paperwork shows he planned to sell Adeline, even though he had just paid a lot of money for her not long before. The sale was set for July 28th, and she was supposed to be taken away right away. On the evening of July 27th, something happened at the Harrington house that investigators never totally figured out. The household records show a dinner had been planned with the Rutledge family, including their oldest daughter Catherine, who everyone figured would probably end up marrying William. The cook Esther had made a big, fancy meal, and the dining room was all set up for 8 people, but not a single person from the Rutledge family ever showed up. According to James, the stable keeper's later statement, a message came in from the Rutledge plantation around 4 in the afternoon, brought by one of their workers. The message was handed straight to William, who was over by the carriages at the time. Whatever it said, William read it quietly and then walked calmly into the main house. He asked to speak with his dad privately in the study. The housekeeper, Mrs. Porter, said she could hear raised voices from behind the closed door, though she couldn't make out the actual words, but it was clearly a heated argument. They went back and forth for almost an hour before William came out, looking pale but calm. He went straight to his room and stayed there until dinner time. Ebenezer came out later, told the staff that dinner would happen as planned even without the Rutledges, and went off to the library with a bottle of brandy. The dinner that night was just Ebenezer and William. Mrs. Porter described the mood as silent as a tomb, with neither man saying a single word through the whole meal. Adeline was one of the people serving that night, and the witnesses noticed that Ebenezer kept watching her super closely, while William kept his eyes down on his plate, barely eating anything. After dinner, Ebenezer went back to the library while William said he needed to ride into Charleston for business. James got his horse ready, noting that it was strange to start that kind of trip so late at night. William left around 8 in the evening. According to James, he came back close to midnight, put his horse away himself, and went into the house through a side door that family members almost never used. What went down in the next few hours has been put together from different people's stories. The house was quiet until around 2 in the morning, when Mrs. Porter woke up to what she described as a horrible crash, like a bookcase had fallen over. She got up, lit a lamp, and went downstairs to check. The sound had come from the library. Through the door, which was partway open, she saw Ebenezer Harrington standing next to his desk, gripping it like he needed it to hold himself up. Right in front of him stood William, very stiff, with his hands clenched at his sides. On the floor were all the contents of Ebenezer's personal safe, which had been hidden behind a painting of his late wife. Mixed in with all the scattered papers and valuables was a small leather-bound book that William was holding open, apparently reading out loud from it, but too quietly for Mrs. Porter to hear the actual words. Whatever he was reading caused Ebenezer to slowly sink down into his chair, his face going completely pale. The housekeeper, scared by how intense the whole thing was, quietly slipped back to her room without letting them know she was there. The next morning, the whole plantation woke up to shocking news. Ebenezer Harrington had suffered what Dr. Dale would later record as a sudden and catastrophic event in his brain. The housekeeper found him in the library, still in his chair, unresponsive but still breathing. The doctor came right away and determined that Ebenezer had experienced a severe stroke that left him paralyzed on his right side and unable to speak. In all the chaos that followed, a second shocking thing was discovered. Adeline had disappeared from the estate. Her few belongings were still in her room, but she herself had vanished sometime during the night. William, staying surprisingly calm given what was happening with his dad, organized the household staff to search the whole property, but they found absolutely nothing. The sale that had been scheduled was obviously called off since the seller was now incapacitated and the person being sold was nowhere to be found. William took over running the household and his dad's business, which would have happened eventually anyway but had now been sped up by everything going on. He made arrangements for his father's care, hired a nurse from Charleston, and turned one of the downstairs sitting rooms into a sick room. Ebenezer Harrington never got his speech or movement back. He hung on for 11 months in that condition, while William ran the plantation with a surprisingly skillful hand. The business records show that, despite being young, he handled the complications of the cotton markets and managing the household in a way that impressed even the most doubtful of his father's old business partners. But he made zero effort to keep looking for Adeline after that first day. He didn't even report her disappearance to the authorities. When Reverend Whitfield asked him about it during a pastoral visit, William reportedly said something like she had probably made her way to family up north and then changed the subject. In the months that followed, William's behavior kept people talking. He turned down every social invitation and focused completely on business and taking care of his father. He started writing a lot of letters to contacts in Philadelphia and Boston, letters the local postmaster George Wilson said were thick bundles that needed extra postage. He ordered unusual books through Charleston merchants, titles about property law in northern states and steamship schedules to European ports. The strangest development came in September when the county records show William registered a deed for a small piece of property on the edge of Charleston, bought in the name of W.H. Trust. The property had a modest little house and 2 acres of land. The neighbors said the house seemed like someone was living there, smoke coming from the chimney and lights on at night, but they never got a clear look at who was inside. By early 1848, rumors were going around Charleston society about William Harrington becoming more and more of a recluse. He barely showed up to church, refused to join the gentlemen's clubs his father had belonged to, and was spotted riding alone along the Battery in the early mornings, looking like he had a lot on his mind. Catherine Rutledge, who everyone had figured would end up with him, got engaged to a plantation owner from Georgia. The announcement in the Charleston paper made a vague reference to an earlier understanding between her and William having been called off amicably. Ebenezer Harrington died on June 15, 1848, never having spoken another word or left his sick room. The funeral was well attended by his business buddies and local families, though William himself was described as kind of emotionally distant in his grief by those who were there. The will went through without any problems and left everything to William as expected. Within a month of his father's burial, William started selling off parts of the family property, beginning with the cotton fields farthest from the main house. Then in November of 1848, something really unexpected happened. William Harrington announced he was going to Europe for a long time. He arranged for his father's old trusted associate, Richard Dawson, to manage the plantation while he was gone, giving him limited legal authority to handle things. The main house would be kept up by a small team of staff with Mrs. Porter in charge in his absence. The Charleston paper printed a short announcement about his departure, saying Mr. William Harrington, having settled his late father's affairs, was leaving the following week for an extended trip to Europe with no set return date. It mentioned he'd sail to Liverpool first and then head to Switzerland, whose mountain air was said to be good for the spirit and the body. What the paper didn't say, but what shipping records later revealed, was that William Harrington had booked passage not just for himself, but for a second person listed in the ship's log as Mrs. W. Harrington. No wedding announcement had appeared in any local paper, and no local minister had performed any ceremony. The mystery got even bigger when James, the stable keeper, reported that on the night before William's departure, a closed carriage showed up at the Harrington estate after dark. The driver stayed with the carriage while a heavily veiled female figure went into the house through that same side door. The carriage left empty 2 hours later, and the next morning William headed to Charleston with 2 large trunks and a smaller bag, bringing no servants with him, which was unusual for a gentleman traveling abroad at that time. The Harrington estate stayed under management for 5 years. During that time, William kept in sporadic contact with Richard Dawson about business matters, sending letters from various European cities: Geneva, Paris, London, Vienna. These letters, which are preserved at the Charleston Historical Society, focused entirely on practical business stuff with no personal information at all beyond formal sign-offs. In 1853, instructions came in from Zurich telling Dawson to sell the remaining Harrington properties, cash out all the assets, and wire the money to a bank in London. Those instructions were carried out, and the Harrington name slowly faded away from Charleston society. The most fascinating piece of this whole puzzle turned up in 1962, when a historian researching antebellum Charleston found a leather-bound journal in the university archives, apparently donated anonymously in the early 1900s. The journal belonged to Elizabeth Harrington, William's mother, and had entries spanning from her marriage all the way up to just before she died. Most of it was regular, everyday stuff about running the house and going to social events, but a series of entries written about a year before her death revealed a jaw-dropping secret. Elizabeth wrote about finding papers in her husband's study that showed Ebenezer, years before they were even married, had fathered a child with a woman who was enslaved on a neighboring plantation. That woman died during childbirth, but the baby girl made it and was raised among the workers there. According to Elizabeth's journal, Ebenezer had quietly kept tabs on the child from a distance, occasionally asking about how she was doing through people he trusted. That child, Elizabeth wrote with clear distress, had been named Adeline. The final entry in Elizabeth's journal, written just weeks before she died, described her inner conflict over this discovery. She wrote about planning to confront Ebenezer after their second baby was born, and to demand that he acknowledge his first daughter and do something for her future in some way that recognized who she actually was. The journal stopped abruptly there, and whatever confrontation she had planned never happened because of her untimely death. What this discovery meant cast the events of 1847 in a really disturbing new light. The story about buying Adeline from a plantation in Virginia appeared to have been made up, a cover story to bring Ebenezer's own daughter into his household without anyone knowing the truth. The notes about her refined appearance and light complexion suddenly meant something very different with this context. Most significantly, the relationship that had apparently grown between William and Adeline had happened without either of them knowing they shared the same father. The small leather-bound book that William found in his father's safe that night was almost certainly his mother Elizabeth's journal. The truth inside it, that the woman William had fallen in love with was his half-sister, had triggered Ebenezer's stroke and set everything else in motion. The small property bought under W.H. Trust was most likely a temporary hiding place for Adeline after she disappeared from the main house. And the veiled woman who joined William the night before he left was almost certainly her. What happened to William and Adeline after they left America is mostly a mystery. Swiss records from 1849 show a William Harrison and wife buying a modest villa near Lake Geneva. British banking records show regular withdrawals from the Harrington funds through a lawyer in London until 1876, when the account went quiet. No death certificates have been found for either William or Adeline under any names they're known to have used, and there's no evidence of any children. The Harrington mansion sat empty for almost a decade before being bought by a family from Philadelphia who knew nothing about what had gone on there. It burned down during the Civil War, leaving only the stone foundation and one chimney standing. Today, the land is part of a suburban neighborhood outside of Charleston, with nothing to mark that anything significant ever happened there. The only physical thing left from this sad story is a small leather journal sitting in a university archive, its pages yellowed with age, holding secrets that destroyed one family and maybe helped create another. In 1968, a researcher trying to trace what happened to William and Adeline found an interesting entry in the visitor logs of a small art gallery in Geneva. A painting had been donated in 1862 by a reclusive couple who were known locally as the Americans, who lived in a villa on the lake. The painting, still in the gallery's collection today, shows a woman standing next to a garden wall, her face turned a little away from the viewer. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, is the outline of a 3-story house with white columns. The painting is simply called Memory of Home, signed only with the initials AH. Maybe some stories are never truly finished, they just turn into something else. The echoes of what happened to the Harrington family keep bouncing through time, reminding us how secrets can poison whole generations, and how the search for freedom and love can push people to walk away from everything they've ever known just for a shot at something real. In the quiet rooms of a museum in Switzerland, a painting watches over visitors who have no idea about the American tragedy captured in those brushstrokes. Meanwhile, in Charleston, tour guides take groups through the old streets telling well-known stories, but never once mentioning the merchant's son who vanished across the ocean carrying his father's biggest secret. In 1968, a researcher trying to trace what happened to William and Adeline found an interesting entry in the visitor logs of a small art gallery in Geneva. A painting had been donated in 1862 by a reclusive couple who were known locally as the Americans, who lived in a villa on the lake shore. The painting, still in the gallery's collection today, shows a woman standing next to a garden wall, her face turned a little away from the viewer. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, is the outline of a 3-story house with white columns. The painting is simply called Memory of Home, signed only with the initials AH. Maybe some stories are never truly finished, they just turn into something else. The echoes of what happened to the Harrington family keep bouncing through time, reminding us how secrets can poison whole generations and how the search for freedom and love can push people to walk away from absolutely everything familiar just for a chance at a new beginning. In the quiet rooms of a Swiss museum, a painting watches over visitors who have no clue about the American tragedy captured right there in the brushstrokes. And in Charleston, tour guides lead groups through the historic streets telling the well-known legends, never once mentioning the merchant's son who disappeared across the ocean with his father's greatest secret. The historian who discovered Elizabeth Harrington's journal, Dr. Margaret Collins of the University of South Carolina, spent nearly 7 years trying to put the whole story together. Her research notes, kept at the university library, show a very careful and detailed investigation that took her from Charleston all the way to Philadelphia, London, and finally Switzerland. What she found in Swiss records both answered some questions and created new ones. According to property records in the Geneva area, William and Adeline, going by the last name Harrison, kept their villa until 1873. Local tax documents listed William's job simply as man of independent means, while Adeline was listed as artist and wife. Church records from a small Protestant congregation near their home show that they were accepted into the community, though they kept a certain distance and never fully became part of local life there. Their neighbors described them as polite but private, speaking French with American accents, and rarely talking about what their lives had been like before Switzerland. Dr. Collins found a particularly revealing document in the records of a local doctor, Dr. Henry Beaumont, who had occasionally treated the couple. His medical notes, written in French, mentioned that Madame Harrison seemed to be in decent health, despite going through multiple miscarriages and a sadness that got worse in the autumn. Even more importantly, Dr. Beaumont recorded a conversation with William during one of those visits, noting that Monsieur Harrison had explained that their not having children was the result of a condition that prevented healthy offspring. And when asked for more details, he got quiet and said only that some family circumstances can't be overcome, and the doctor wrote that he could feel a deep sorrow underneath William's calm exterior. This cryptic little note suggests that William and Adeline knew about their blood relationship and what that meant for any children they might have. The journal that had revealed their shared parentage had apparently given them enough information to understand the biological risks of being together, and that had apparently led to their decision to not have kids, even though there had been multiple pregnancies. Life for the Harrisons in Switzerland seems to have been comfortable but careful. They traveled here and there to Paris and Vienna based on passport records, but always came back to their lakeside villa. Records show they bought extra land next to their home in 1866, expanded their gardens, and added a small studio where Adeline painted landscapes and portraits that were occasionally shown in local galleries. Then in 1873, something shifted in their lives. Property records show the villa being sold to a British banker, and the couple disappears from Swiss records after that. Banking documents from London show the Harrison account getting a big deposit that year, likely from the property sale, and then a new account being opened at a bank in Florence, Italy. Dr. Collins followed that trail to Tuscany, where she found records of an American couple buying a small olive farm outside Florence in early 1874. The names on the deed were William and Anna Harrison. The description in the property records matched Adeline, an American wife, about 46 years old with a light complexion. The couple seemed to have been looking for even more privacy in that quiet rural Italian setting, getting even farther away from the society they had left behind. The most heartbreaking discovery in Dr. Collins' research came from the archives of a small church near the Harrison property in Italy. In 1876, the parish recorded the death of William Harrison, age 52, from a lung infection after a winter illness. His wife Anna arranged for his burial in the church cemetery, where his gravestone, worn down but still readable when Dr. Collins visited, simply says, "William H., born of one world, found peace in another." What happened to Adeline after William died is only partly known. Italian property records show she kept ownership of the farm for another 11 years, living there alone based on the tax documents. Local memory that Dr. Collins collected through interviews with elderly residents described La Vedova Americana, the American widow, as a quiet woman who painted and tended her olive trees, occasionally selling small landscape paintings to visitors from Florence. In 1887, the property was sold to an Italian family and Anna Harrison disappears from official records. But Dr. Collins found one more interesting detail in the archives of a women's boarding house in Rome. A guest register entry from November 1887 lists an A. Harrison, an American widow, approximately 60 years old, moving in. The boarding house was for respectable women of modest means, especially artists and writers who wanted affordable housing in the city. After that, the trail goes cold. No death certificate for Anna or Adeline Harrison has been found in Rome's records. The boarding house's paperwork ends in 1893 when it closed down. One last intriguing possibility showed up in passenger lists from ships sailing from Naples to New York in 1890. A Mrs. A. Harrison is listed among the second-class passengers, her age given as 62, her previous home listed as Italy. Whether this was Adeline going back to America after more than 40 years of being away remains unconfirmed. Dr. Collins' research notes wrap up with a reflection on the limits of what historical investigation can actually find out. She wrote that some lives deliberately step away from being documented, looking for the freedom that comes with staying anonymous. William and Adeline, or the Harringtons as they were born, seem to have made that choice, leaving just enough traces to confirm they existed but not enough to fully reveal their inner lives. Maybe that was their final act of self-determination, controlling not just how they lived, but how they would be remembered or not remembered at all. The mystery might have stayed buried in academic circles if it weren't for a strange discovery. In 1965, during a renovation of an old brownstone in Boston's Back Bay, workers found a hidden compartment in the attic wall with a tin box inside. Inside the box were several items, a small leather-bound book with blank pages except for the inscription, "To A, from W, remember only what brings peace." There was also a pressed magnolia flower, a daguerreotype of a young man in formal clothes who was probably William, and most significantly, several letters. The letters, dated from 1891 through 1894, were addressed to "My dearest friend" and signed simply A. They were written from a boarding house in Boston's South End to someone identified only as M., apparently a woman who had befriended the writer. The contents suggest an elderly woman looking back on her extraordinary life while being very careful not to reveal specific details. In one letter from February 1892, she writes that she had returned to America perhaps out of a desire to complete the circle, to end where she began, though not in the same place or situation. She wrote that the South held no appeal for her since too many ghosts walk those gardens, but that in Boston, where the winter grips the city with ice, she found a strange comfort that nobody looks twice at an elderly widow who keeps to herself, and that kind of anonymity was its own kind of freedom. Another letter from December of that same year gives the most direct reference to her past. She wrote to M. that her curiosity about life before Europe was natural but couldn't be satisfied, that some stories can't be told, even after all the main people involved have passed from this world. She wrote that what might look like romance was also tragedy, and what seemed like escape was also exile. She asked her friend to know only that she had loved completely a man who gave up everything worldly for her sake and she for his, and that whatever judgment might be placed on them, they had answered to their own hearts first and found that to be enough. The final letter in the collection, dated April 1894, has the tone of a goodbye. She wrote that her health was failing with the melting snow, that the doctor made reassuring sounds but his eyes told a different story. She said she wasn't afraid, that she had lived a life so far beyond what was ever meant for her that every day had been an unexpected gift. She said the paintings she was giving her friend M were her real legacy, not for any great artistic skill, but for the memories they contained, the garden wall, the lake at sunset, the olive grove in morning light, and that each one held a chapter of a story she could never write down in words. No death record for Adeline exists in Boston City files under the name Harrison, which suggests she might have taken on yet another identity in her final years, or maybe passed away somewhere else entirely. The brownstone where the letters were found had changed hands so many times since the 1890s that it was impossible to figure out who M was or how those letters ended up hidden in the wall. The Harrington Harrison story might have stayed mostly unknown if Dr. Collins hadn't published a small booklet about her findings in 1969, titled Across Boundaries: The Exile of William and Adeline. That limited academic publication caught the eye of a novelist who was researching antebellum Charleston and who adapted parts of the story into a historical novel published in 1972. Though it was fictionalized and romanticized, the novel brought attention to the original research and sparked renewed interest in the actual historical figures. In 1978, a descendant of Richard Dawson, the man who had managed the Harrington plantation during William's years away, found additional letters in a family archive. These letters exchanged between Dawson and William during the early years in Switzerland revealed that Dawson had known the true nature of William and Adeline's relationship and had actually helped make their escape from Charleston happen. His reason for helping, a deathbed promise to Elizabeth Harrington, who had apparently left her journal in his care and asked him to help her children if the truth ever came out. The most haunting artifact connected to this story is still the painting at the gallery in Geneva. Art historians who have looked at it say that while the technique is that of a talented hobbyist rather than a trained professional, the emotional power of the painting is remarkable. The woman's posture, facing away from the plantation house but still acknowledging its presence, captures the central tension of Adeline's whole existence. She is at the same time connected to and pushed away from her birthplace, tied to it by blood but shut out of its privileges. Visitors to the gallery who don't know anything about the painting's history often say there's a sad atmosphere to it, a feeling of something precious and painful caught forever in oil and canvas. The story it tells without words is one of impossible choices, of identities built up and thrown away, and of the price paid for the freedom to love. In that sense, Memory of Home is both a piece of art and a piece of evidence, a visual testimony to lives that official history would have completely wiped away. What remains unclear and probably unknowable is exactly when William and Adeline found out about the nature of their relationship. Did they learn they were half-siblings before or after their feelings for each other had already developed? Did that knowledge make them fight against their attraction at first, only to give in later? Or did they make peace with their unusual situation, reasoning that a society that had already denied Adeline's humanity had absolutely no moral authority over their hearts? The journals, letters, and documents don't give a definitive answer to those questions. What they do show is that whatever moral calculations the couple made, they committed to their decision completely, giving up wealth, status, and their homeland rather than separating. Their chosen exile speaks to both the power of what they had together and how impossible it would have been to maintain it within the social rules of 19th century America. The story of William and Adeline exists in the in-between spaces of historical records, showing up in bits and pieces from ship manifests, property deeds, medical notes, and personal letters. It challenges the usual narratives about plantation life in the antebellum South, pointing to complexities and human connections that official histories often covered up or ignored. Most importantly, it shows how individual people could defy the rigid categories that society tried to put them in, seeking their own personal truth at an enormous personal cost. In 1982, one final discovery added a kind of ending note to their story. A small museum in Boston acquired a collection of paintings from a private estate, including several attributed to A.H. One canvas, smaller than the others and apparently left unfinished, shows two figures walking away from the viewer along a tree-lined path. Their faces aren't visible, but the way they're standing, an older man leaning slightly on a woman's arm as they walk, suggests both closeness and dependence on each other. The background shows mountains that art historians say look like the landscape near Florence. The painting has no title on its frame, but on the back, written in faded pencil, are 3 words: the path chosen. The Harrington story faded again from public attention by the 1990s, remembered mostly by specialists in antebellum history. But it keeps popping up occasionally in unexpected places: a footnote in studies of plantation households, a reference point in examinations of racial identity in the American South, a case study in research methodology classes showing how fragmentary evidence can be pieced together into a historical narrative. Maybe the most fitting memorial to William and Adeline came in 2005, when the University of South Carolina created a digital archive dedicated to alternative family structures in antebellum America. The Harrington-Harrison documents formed the centerpiece of that collection, with Elizabeth's journal, William's business correspondence, and images of Adeline's paintings made available to researchers all around the world. The archive's introduction acknowledges that while their story is exceptional, it points to bigger truths about how people navigated, resisted, and sometimes rose above the rigid social rules of their time. In the quiet reading rooms of archives from Charleston to Geneva, in the digital databases of universities, and in the memories of people who have come across their story, William and Adeline continue to exist not as historical curiosities or romantic legends, but as real human beings who made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. Their story reminds us that underneath the big sweeping movements of history and social systems, individual lives play out with complexity, contradiction, and courage that records can only partially capture. The sound of their footsteps along Swiss lake shores and Tuscan olive groves faded away a long time ago. The hands that wrote those letters and painted those canvases have long since turned to dust. But something essential remains: the testimony of lives that were determined to define themselves rather than be defined by others, to find connection across boundaries that were designed to keep them apart, and to create meaning in a world that denied their right to exist as equals. In that testimony lies both their tragedy and their triumph.